All right, guys, this is the second half of standard 3.4. Hopefully you've already watched the first half, or this won't make a whole lot of sense. So if not, maybe go back and find that video. So last time that we talked, which for you was probably just a minute ago, although you can see it's a new day for me, new outfit and such. Last time we talked about John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and their impact on the government as a whole. And we talked about how Rockefeller in particular creates these things called trusts, where he controls all of, in his case, the oil industry in the United States. Well, that freaks out a lot of people. They say, well, no one person should have control over all of the oil industry, or any industry for that matter. And so the government passes a law called the Sherman Antitrust Act. Sherman's the guy's name. He's actually the cousin of the March to the Sea Sherman. So don't get those guys confused. But basically this law says trusts, bad idea. We're not going to have any one guy control all that stuff. And this severely limits what the big business can get away with. So Rockefeller goes back to the drawing board and he says, what am I going to do? Because clearly the antitrust law, you can see the political cartoon, is beating up these trust guys. There's a steel trust, the oil trust, the railroad trust. He's beating them up and he's putting them in the grave. So Rockefeller says, what can I do? And he comes up with a whole new type of an agency, or a whole new type of business, which is called the holding company. This is a little bit technical, so you may or may not get this. If you don't, I think you're going to be okay. But with the holding company, they still, like Standard Oil, would still control most of the oil companies in the United States. But instead of controlling all of them, it would only own 51% of them, just more than half. So it still gets to make decisions, it still gets most of the profit, and he gets to continue his monopoly. Now, if you don't understand what I was saying, here's the idea. Basically, the government comes in and says, you can't have a trust. And he says, okay, I'm going to come up with something that's basically the same thing. It's going to be legal enough that I'm allowed to have it. So he's a sketchy kind of a dude, right? So there is a question. Should we say that these guys are crooks? Are they robbers? Or are they the kind of folks who are actually going to help us advance our society, make industry what it needs to be in the United States? Well, if you think that's the case, you would probably call them captains of industry. These are guys who helped guide our industrial sector to where it needs to be in the 20th century. On the other hand, if you say, no, these guys are rich and they got their money from taking it from others, then you might call them robber barons. Think about a baron in like fairy tales or something. Barons are usually European guys who are really, really rich, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with being rich. But if you call him a robber baron, you're saying he got his money by taking it from other people. And that's not okay. There's a lot of debate even today about which is more applicable to these guys. Now, these guys have to have some philosophies in order to live with themselves, because they look around and they see that they're very, very rich, like the folks on the right, but right next to them there's a huge amount of poverty. So how do you wake up in the morning in this place that has, I don't know, a pool on your deck, on your patio, and you look down at all this poverty? Like, how do you live with yourself? Well, Carnegie and Rockefeller and those guys tended to a belief in social Darwinism and laissez-faire capitalism. And you say, well, what are those? I'm glad you asked. Social Darwinism is the idea that the strong survive. That's Darwinism. The strong survive is Darwinism, along with the idea that only the fittest are going to survive in any given place. I've said that like 3 times. Forgive me for that. Social Darwinism is taking that same biological concept and saying, you know what, if I'm rich and you're poor, that's because I'm more suited to survive in this environment. And you should just, if you die off, you die off. Nobody should stop that, because that's the way of the world. And so they would say the government should totally keep its hands off and not get involved in these things. That's debatable, obviously. So that idea that the government should keep its hands off is what we call laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire is a French term that more or less means hands off. So the government should keep its hands off of businesses. It shouldn't tell them how much to pay their people. It shouldn't tell them what kind of safety requirements they should be following. It shouldn't tell them what kind of paint they should use, because that's too much government intervention. Now, you might say, yeah, I like that. That makes sense. There's a little quirk here, and that is that these same guys would say, yes, the government should definitely pass a tariff so that people buy American goods instead of foreign goods. Well, wait, isn't that government intervention? I'm confused. They would also want the government to come in and break up strikes. When their workers quit working, they would want the government to come in and take care of that. So they're a little bit maybe not being consistent. You see ideas like the social Darwinism concept to some degree show up with a number of people. One of them is Horatio Alger, who's an author. And he writes books like this one over here, From Farm Boy to Senator. The idea is you can start in the most humble beginnings and you can grow into a very, very wealthy and powerful individual. Now, is that possible in the United States? Yes, 100% yes, absolutely. Rags to riches has happened. Lots and lots of people who are wealthy started out as being poor. But here's the problem. A lot of very, very rich or very poor people who work really, really hard and aren't going to get rich. I know some folks who are very, very sick and have been for a very long time. They're really hard workers, but they just can't provide for their families because of the situation that they find themselves in. Are we going to look at them and say, you're lazy, you should like die off? I don't think so. So what I'm saying is I'm okay with this idea that you can move from one to the other. And honestly, I think the United States is one of the best countries in the world for that kind of a change. But it's not necessarily going to happen for everybody. Okay. Well, Carnegie says, that's okay. The wealthy have a responsibility to take care of those who are not. He calls this idea the gospel of wealth. Gospel is a term that means good news. He says, I have good news. I'm rich, and I'm going to help you with that wealth. And so he actually gives money to all kinds of people. He gives it to the arts. He gives it to colleges. He gives it to libraries. And there are people even today who are still reaping the benefits of his generosity and his wealth. This makes people look at him and say, hey, you're great. We love you, Carnegie. You might say, what about Rockefeller? Wasn't that guy kind of sketchy? And the answer is maybe. He decides he's going to give a lot of money away, though, too, but he really does it mostly after the public looks at his business practices and says, I don't know about those. And after the government starts to question whether or not the trusts are a good idea. So overall, there is a rise in the standard of living in the late 1800s. There are all kinds of new products being invented, like the typewriter and like the telephone. There is a general deflation. That means prices are more or less going to go down on some of these things. There's mass production. We're making many of these items at a time. It's not the same as the assembly line yet, but we're making many of the same products at once. And overall, prices are, like I said, going to go down. So there's a lot of stuff going on here that's going to be really, really good, but there are also some very difficult things that are going to start up, and we'll talk about those more in the next couple sections. So this has been Standard 4.3. If you have any questions, as always, you can reach me at ngallion@greermiddlecollege.org, and I will see you next time.